Hello, everyone. Welcome to Kingston Writers Fest on this gorgeous Sunday afternoon. My name is Ara McCauley, and I'm very pleased to present Wine, Women, and Words. This event is an hour and a half long and includes a Q&A. This may be interspersed within the conversation or at the end. The ushers will have microphones, so please wait for one to be passed to you before you start chatting. Some thank yous. Kingston Writers Fest would like to thank Stephen Page in memory of Joanne Page, author patron of Jennifer LoveGrove. Virginia Gordon and Lynn Kenny, author patrons of Alison Pick.
We can do it all at the end.
Maureen Lascelle, Susan Olding, and Colleen Palat, author patrons of Karen Connelly. And the anonymous author patron of Leanne Dunic. We'd like to thank the League of Canadian Poets.
Wine, women, words. There we go.
We'd also like to thank the grantors, institutions, businesses, and book-loving individuals who support and donate to the festival. Their financial support and yours is critical as we enter our 10th year of bringing the best writers from Canada and the world to Kingston. Pick up a postcard or visit our hallway volunteers table to discover how you can become a part of the celebration in year 10. Finally, our thanks to the dedicated volunteers who work year-round to make the festival one of the top literary events in the country. So, yay! Just a reminder to please turn off the ring on your phone and feel free to purchase a glass of wine, beer, spirit of choice throughout the event. We'll count on you to be respectful of the authors in the audience as the timing of your movements, but the bar will be open throughout the next hour and a half. Do fill out a comment card or complete an online survey at kingstonwritersfest.ca for the chance to win a few fabulous prizes. And please join the writers at the back of the room afterwards to get your books signed. You can buy copies in our festival bookstore, and Oscar has said that they are keeping the bookstore open until after this event has ended. So if you're so moved, you can rush off at the end of this and pick up your copies and get them signed. So now it is my pleasure to introduce the authors. Karen Connelly is the author of nearly a dozen books of poetry and fiction. While much of her literary output has focused on human violence and oppression, her latest title, The Change Room, which the Globe and Mail calls a warm, refreshing swim on a frigid day, explores more inward and intimate themes of marriage, sex, adultery, and house cleaning. Leanne Dunic has published fiction, poetry, and nonfiction in various magazines and anthologies and chapbooks in Asia, North America, and the UK. In 2015, she won the Alice Munro Short Story Contest, judged by Lisa Moore, who declared her a bold and exciting new voice. To Love the Coming End is her debut collection, a lyrical travelogue that explores loss and trauma on the global and personal stage. Jennifer LoveGrove is the author of a Giller Prize long-listed novel and two previous poetry collections. She comes to us today with her newly published Beautiful Children with Pet Foxes, a poetic reflection of the themes of alienation, trauma, delusion, and fear that the Globe says stretches the possibility of lyric expression with a dreamlike twist. Alison Pick, and I love that they actually magically sat in the order of my introductions. Alison Pick is the Man Booker-nominated author of the novel Far to Go. She has also written an acclaimed memoir and several collections of poetry. Author Lauren Groff calls her one of the wisest and most compassionate of writers. Today she presents her long-awaited new novel, Strangers with the Same Dream, an exploration of the dark side of utopian dreams. Please welcome them now.
Welcome.
I will just say, as we start, so this is an unmoderated panel. I don't know about you guys. I have never been on one. And we had some emailing in advance, and there are two of us here today who were terrified by the idea and like to know exactly what's coming, have somebody else ask the questions, have notes, be very prepared, and two of us who are super happy to be spontaneous and say whatever comes into our minds. And
so guess which one's
it's your
which.
responsibility. At the end, you're going to have to say who's who.
Yeah.
So the
That's a
audience
good idea.
to
That's
decide
right.
which is which.
My pile of notes wouldn't give that away at all.
On your marks, get set, go.
We could start with the reading.
Sure.
Let's do that.
She makes an excellent project manager. Why don't you start? Or no. Oh, no, I said I was going to. Yeah. I'm already giving away that I'm not a prepared person. Okay. But very spontaneous. Clearly. So this is my book. It's called To Love the Coming End. And it's a book that has several narrative threads. And it's kind of hard to explain. And so what I often say is that it's being called poetry in Canada and it's being called fiction in the States. So it's just a thing. It's a book. So it's a book. And ultimately, it explores personal trauma, geographical trauma, and collective trauma. And it touches on the earthquake that happened in Japan in March 2011. So this book takes place in 2011. Respiration is forgetful. Circulation refuses my hands. Pain in my skull is equatorial. Wake with vessels broken in my ear. No cocaine, but heart palpitations. Jaw is fixed, walk toes curled, denude cells like a mountainside. Skin births freckles worth watching. Strands of bitter brown turn to bone filaments. The cinch of a muscle bends me in half. Shoulder is electric. Eardrums resound frequencies. Eyes closed, I see music in black and white when we all know there is no such thing. Ribs restrict the ability to sing. Memories become dreams, and dreams are where I peel dry sections of lip. Sleep leaves imprints of fingers round my neck. Looking behind is a physical impossibility. Why my tail still twitches in your hand. Dentist. Do you wear your mouth guard every night? Doctor. These ailments, stress. Chiropractor. Torsion, tension, relax. Massage therapist. You need a counselor, not an RMT. Counselor. Not stressed. Sad. Heart. The work is too much. This book travels between Singapore, Japan, and the coast of British Columbia, which is where I'm from. And for those who live in this inland world of Ontario, on the Pacific Rim, we're threatened by this thing called earthquakes. And I'm pretty sure there isn't a writer in Vancouver who, or in the west coast of North America, who doesn't have that just subconsciously threatening them every single day. Within me, a gaping crevice. The more I change my environment, the more I lose track of myself, yet I traverse. Maybe that's the point. Nothing is anchored. Today is unstable, easy for people and land to split. Minerals grind a geological dance. The balance of the Earth's axis shifts. Chile, Indonesia, New Zealand, Haiti, Japan. Where next? The unsure crust hectors the Pacific Northwest. Evidence of instability buried under substrate. A story mounds. Volcanoes circle the Pacific. Enamored with its terrestrial beauty and sea, British Columbia forgets it lies on a restless coast scattered with summits of hardened lava, pumice, volcanic ash. Imagine a seismic rip. Plates warp, lock, pull. Instant fractures. After, shocks. In the horizon, a wave emerges. A white line becomes a mountain. Surge and retreat, thunder and silence, sirens, rush of the waves return, grab, toss, suck, slam, sweep. Ghosts swarm a floating world. Should I read another page?
Yes.
Okay. Didn't time this. I don't know. Maybe I will read. So I wrote a book, but I also wrote an album, and it goes with the book. So this is it here. It's not out yet, but it's called To Love the Coming End of the World. And this is To Love the Coming End. And in the back of the book, there's actually a download for 3 of the songs. And so I'm going to read one of the pages that refers to the second song on the album, which is called Other Gods. On top of sweaty sheets, I exist without basic order. Order of hydration, of eating, of relieving myself of concentrated urine. Buddha says existence is suffering, desire is suffering. To be awake with one's anxieties is suffering. If I can sleep, then I can survive, but there's something I desire, something that in my rest-deprived state seems attainable. Reunion. Perhaps through dreams, but then there would have to be sleep, without worry, without unnamed guilt. Reality is unreality. I have no references to validate my existence. Mornings and nights, I pray to other gods. Okay, I'll read one more. It's possible that a love's sole purpose is to be unrequited, to build a pressure without release until we can find an act that allows for it to escape, to seep or burst from us. There are the common ones: booze, drugs, travel, academia, sex. I've tried them all. Certainly none are enough to make up for the fissure inside. Only an attempt to find a new way to breathe, to place yourself in the world of without. That was beautiful.
I'm really, I think maybe we can chat a bit between readers, if that's cool with everyone. I think that's really interesting what you were saying before you read, that it's characterized, the book is characterized as poetry here, but fiction in the US release. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? It's unusual. Was that something that you had planned with the book, or did this kind of come after, or how does that work, and what do these categories sort of mean to you?
I don't like labels. I don't like categories. So I wish it didn't have to be categorized, but for marketing purposes, obviously it needed to be categorized. When you were just saying that just now, I'm like, oh, Americans, they just want to think it's fiction because they don't want to believe that there are environmental threats or, whatever. So I actually don't think that about my publisher at all. They're really progressive people, and I don't think that's their situation. But I think because there are several narrative threads through the book, that makes it feel more novel-like. But I think people don't understand like this is what it looks like inside.
Yeah,
like,
that's what I was thinking.
If there's space, it's clearly poetry. And I don't subscribe to that. But whatever people are comfortable with.
Because I kind of read it as related prose poems, I guess, if you have to put a label on it. But yeah, they were clearly linked, but they were also very discrete poems in and of themselves. But there were sort of recurring themes or narratives that ran through it. But
well, that's just the thing. No one would publish any excerpt from this book beforehand because there was no title for each page. So I would have to say that this non-categorization aspect of this book has actually just been nothing but problems. I wouldn't recommend it to a friend.
See, labels are good. There's a reason why we have labels.
There's a reason why we have constructs of all kinds.
We haven't even had the wine yet. Nothing but problems.
Yeah, exactly. And you know what? I thought it was funny. I was put on this panel because it's like wine, women, and words. And I'm like, I don't like wine. So, but I could
I'll
possibly
drink your
talk
wine
to
for you.
Oh man, I got hot water. That's my Asian genes.
I like wine. I'm gonna.
So can I ask a question? Like just on the,
Yes.
just about, I wasn't sure, I wondered when I was reading this if you, like your novel is, Alison's novel is about the establishing of the kibbutz, a kibbutz system or practice in early Israel. And this is, I couldn't tell if this was, so in some ways that was like a going home, going to the motherland, establishing this new world. And I thought about your book as, I wondered, is the voice, is the speaker in the book, is she going home? Is she trying to establish a connection to a place that her family or that she herself is connected to, or and I couldn't tell. Is it there and I missed it, or?
I'll speak to a couple things about that. One is that the narrator is intentionally not gendered and not racialized, and so there isn't anything that would give you a clue. There's nothing
there for sure
for that,
right?
But also speaking to like the difference between what Alison is doing and my book is. I think it's like transnational identity, which is something that's more prevalent now than the time that Alison's book takes place in it, but where people are trying to connect to their heritage. And the narrator of this book actually is going to a writers' festival to talk about their book, which is called Performing Asian. So what it means to be Asian and the actual performance of that. So it was speaking to race and identity, but not in a way that I wanted a reader to actually link up and say, okay, this is their homeland, or they're connecting to their own. And also because it takes place in 3 different countries.
Well, that was one of the things that was interesting about it. I was like, okay, so I mean, I'm saying she because the author is female, but I was just wondering, is she all of these? That's what I ended with. I thought, okay, so she is all of these identities somehow, and it doesn't really, it's never stated, it never becomes explicit, the identity. Mm-hmm. So I thought you did that really well. Like I kept wondering throughout the book, I kind of, because I write so much about place myself, I was sort of drifting in and out of worlds. And it's hard to do that and not irritate a reader, actually, because we do want to we do want to somehow be fixed, right? I think that's pretty common reading both poetry and fiction. So somehow, I think that worked. Like just the idea of a transnational identity and a self that is actually amorphous in a way, and that kind of stretchiness comes out. Like you have the sense of this character being pulled across the world and alive to the world. You know, we mentioned in some of the emails that we wrote back and forth just the aliveness, trying to understand what it is to be alive in the world and to show that on the page. So we each have, sort of different ways and approaches to doing that.
And I was wondering about if you would tell us about your process with the book. One of the things that I'm interested in is the more I go down the path of the writing life, just hearing other people's processes. So how did you think of the book before you sat down to write it? And
I didn't think, if that's not clear already. It's my first book, so I feel like speaking to that is speaking just to getting a book out of your body. Mm-hmm. I wrote a novel 3 times that will never get published. I wrote a book of poetry also about the same amount of times that will never get published. I wrote this book, like the first draft, which is essentially it, in a month. And I feel like that was a gift, but I also then realized in hindsight, well, I did write 2 books before this that didn't work. And I think that
do the average.
Yes, do the average. And I do think that those processes were like schools for me in learning how to do this. And so this book started out as a short story, and then I let a friend read it, and she's like, this would be really cool as prose poems. And then that opened the floodgates. As soon as she said that, it almost like she gave me permission to try a different format, and it really did write itself. And so, yeah, there were themes I had written in my other books that came out to this, but also just like circumstances that, like the right things at the right time. Like the Japanese author Yukio Mishima comes up a lot in this book, and that's because like I just happened to watch this interview with him that really fascinated me, and then he just became a big part of the book, and just things like that just kept entering the pathway of the book, and it all seemed very fortuitous, and it worked really, like everything just worked really well. I don't know, it was a blessing. I feel like I'll never be able to do it again. Might be true.
Leanne, you will. You'll be able to do it. Have faith.
They're all different too, right? I'm like Alison. I'm really interested in process. I used to have a literary radio show in Toronto, and it was like hour-long live interviews with fellow writers, and that's pretty much all we talked about was sort of process-driven stuff. But I mean, I find that with every book, the process can be just completely different from what the last one was. So may we all have a draft in a month. That's pretty much like the writer's lottery.
You set the bar
right
there. You set the bar. Okay, let's go home.
But, you know.
We'll meet back here in 6 weeks.
In my novel,
I mean, it hasn't
6
happened
years.
since, obviously. I mean, I wrote this book 2 years ago, and it hasn't happened since.
But yeah, I guess I'm saying this, each book or manuscript is such a different animal that the process to get to any kind of sense of having something finished to work with can be a completely different kind of experience every time. Like my novel took 6 years, and hopefully the next one will not take 6 years.
6 years seems totally respectable to me.
I know, 6 years is pretty reasonable for a literary novel.
It felt long, though.
It is long. It's a long time. How long did you work on your novel, Allie?
3 years.
This one.
Yeah, 3 years.
And okay, process, but also subject matter. Why did you choose to write this book?
Oh, I hate that question.
I'm sorry. I love
but
that
I love
question.
you. I feel like these questions sort of like all the questions in the vein of why did you do a certain thing? It's sort of like, I have no idea. I don't know.
Oh, come on. You
It's
do. There must be a reason.
Well, it's very intuitive and sort of visceral to me. I had written these books that were preoccupied with Judaism, and there was a lot of, I was constantly getting comments about, you can't understand Judaism until you go to Israel, and I had never been, so I went a bunch of times, and that for sure influenced just thinking about Palestine in the 1920s, and I knew I wanted to write something historical, and so what better place where there's everything you need, right? There's drama and there's tension. The stakes are very high. There's all sorts of groups of people with a big stake in what's about to happen, and the reader is going to bring a certain awareness, even if you don't know anything about the particulars of the Middle East. We all know that the Middle East today is fraught and extremely difficult. So that, and then I got 3 big Bristol boards and started to like draw arrows from thing to thing, and I don't, you know, it just. I often use the analogy of there's a lake and there's like a thing coming out of the lake and it's foggy and you're kind of squinting and there's that thing coming out of the lake.
There's no lake in her novel, and there's no thing that comes out of a lake or anything like that. It's truly a metaphor.
What is it? What is that thing?
I think you should read.
That's what I was going to say. It's
Yeah.
a good segue to read us an excerpt.
Yeah.
The part with the thing.
And yeah, don't read the swamp thing part, because, you know.
All right.
Swamp thing.
I will just read straight from the beginning, and I don't have to explain anything.
There
So
we go.
good.
Once upon a time.
There was a lake. This story begins with a lie. I killed myself. That's what they said. They made me pay with that particular shame. When our descendants spoke of me, I was not named, but instead called the suicide, or sometimes the first suicide. a cautionary tale. Committing suicide meant no burial, no mourning rites, no Kaddish, no winding sheets, no Shiva, no final consolations, just as for me there had been no daughterhood or motherhood, no group of people who could stand in for the family I never had, alone in death as I had been in life. Back then, to kill yourself was a sin. It brought great disgrace, which of course is what they wanted. Well, maybe I deserved it after the damage I had done. We lived that whole year pushed up against death, illness, accident, things more sinister still. There was a gun, and we argued over it like the children that we were. Who could touch it? Who could hold it? Who would be the first to discharge the verdict of its bullets? The first time I saw it, I knew somehow that it would be the instrument of my death. I could not have guessed the story that would come first. Now I am dead, and that story is all I know. I revisit it, questioning my judgment, my motivation, and mostly I'm graced now with compassion for myself I didn't have in life. I understand why I did what I did and why sometimes I kept silent. I can forgive my mistakes. Still, it is small consolation to be alone in forgiving yourself. I would like for you to understand me too. What does a ghost want? Redemption, to tell her story. And you are the ones I have chosen to tell. You are my own chosen people. Now that I've been snipped free from linear time, I can drift back and forth as I wish. Far in the future lies the bloom of what we planted. It is your bloom now. The future is a tangle I prefer not to visit. Instead, I go backward as ghosts love to do. I want to take you with me to that first year when we were living only for each moment, and each moment contained the whole of time, a kind of perpetual present that we grew to take for granted. That first year when the swamps were drained, when the land was readied and the fields were sown, when the crops first faltered and then thrived. The year when, despite our failures, something bigger grew up all around us. How proud we were, how satisfied. How could we have known what was coming? When the story of the first year is told, and it is in poems and songs and books, our descendants gloss over the sickness, the long months of near starvation, the mix of Jews and Arabs whose backs they stood upon. Is truth revealed over time? I wish I could say so, but nobody knows the full scope of what happened, to all of us and to me. I wish it didn't matter, but my honor is at stake. I would like my truth to stand so my name might be spoken, if not in the hushed tones of reverence given to the founding members, then at least with respect. I did my best. I came up short. Can any of you claim otherwise? Time for some wine.
I love that the book opens with a ghost,
Yeah.
and I'm very fond of ghost characters in fiction and poetry, but I don't know. I'm into ghosts, so
It's weird how there's like
I'm
a
also into
zeitgeist,
ghosts.
right? I feel like there's a bunch of ghosts. People are writing about ghosts, which I
Yeah.
didn't.
How did you come to the decision to employ a ghostly narrator kind of that came in and out of the book?
There was a lake.
No, it was a ghost that was coming out of the lake.
You thought it was
There was a
mist.
thing coming out of the lake. So there's three voices in the novel, and it sort of goes over one period of time from three different perspectives. And then I knew that I sort of wanted like some kind of overarching a voice or a set of eyes that could see the book as a whole. And then it was a ghost.
Was it different writing a ghost character as opposed to a living character? Did you have different kind of techniques?
It was, and it's been interesting. The book is just newly out, and so I'm on the ego roller coaster of great review, terrible review, on the list, not on the list, mostly not on the list. And some of the reviews have mentioned the ghost, and so it's one of those... I don't know if you guys feel like this, but sometimes for me when a book comes out, there's still piece that you don't know if you should have done differently, and I feel a little bit like that about the ghost. That, it was quite different, and my editor and I had lots of back and forth about, does she need to be as fully developed as one of the flesh and blood characters? Well, no, because she's a ghost precisely, and but like Kaz is saying, the reader craves like being grounded and knowing sort of those fleshy details and where they are, and so it was different, and I may not have landed it exactly, but it was fun to write.
Yeah, I kind of did that a little bit with my novel too, a character that was sort of it was more of a ghostly presence in earlier versions than how it finally ended up, but I really enjoyed kind of you write that character a little bit differently, and it's a bit liberating because you can have some fun with it. So,
and things like timeline and there's all kinds of different things you can play with. What was it like for you?
Well, I had to cut most of her point of view in the end, but
she killed the ghost.
Yeah, I killed it. See, that's a weird irony. But I think it was important writing that was done in that perspective, because it fed into how the novel ended up anyway. But I had fun with it. It was sort of creepy and sad, but so was a lot of the book. But no, I enjoyed it. But it was a little bit of a different strategy than writing another character, I think. Yeah.
And what was your, was there lots of planning for your novel, or?
I'm just going to talk about my novel that's 3 years old instead of my new book. But in some ways, I think fiction is easier to talk about than poetry. Yes. But definitely I was like you with the Bristol board charts on the walls. Yeah, I love that part.
You can just draw a line right down the middle. Spontaneous writers in the notes.
I'm very spontaneous with poetry. I don't know what I'm... Like, it's not planned, and when I sit down to write, I mostly don't know what's going to come. So that's very spontaneous, but when I write fiction, it's like I'm using the other side of my brain completely, and it is more planned, and I do enjoy that structural stuff big time. And I have big timeline charts and color coding, all that stuff. But with poetry, it's completely the opposite. So it's like, my poetry is like my right side of the brain, and fiction is my left side of the brain, or however that works. I don't know. Some people are nodding, so I think that's a good sign.
I use Excel spreadsheets, which I don't think you saw coming. But I like, especially when things have they're multifaceted. For my next project, which is actually my thesis for my MFA, is a concept album, and I need to stay organized and make sure I'm sticking to the concept. So I have a spreadsheet to like thematically order my songs and and figure out what part. My album's based on a short story I wrote, so then it's so complicated. Maybe I should use the Bristol boards.
That's really cool though. What's the music like? What kind of style of music do you work in? I forgot, she doesn't like labels.
I really don't know. And whenever people come to a show or something, like, what's my music sound like? And then they're like, oh gosh. And then so I just don't get anywhere to figure out. But I mean, I know what I think it's a little bit like rock, a little bit like progressive rock. One word that's used to describe it is cinematic, which is also another word that's used to describe my writing. So cinematic.
Well, we're going to download the songs that you have in the book then. That's cool.
Yeah, please do.
Cool. So one thing that I wanted to ask you too, we didn't get a view of this in the excerpt that you just read, but a lot of your Strangers book is about the women's work on the kibbutz and in the kibbutz, and just the variety of work that they did, and including childcare work. And I was really fascinated and surprised, and just wanted to ask you. So there's a scene where we as readers learn that the women who have babies are not trusted to look after their own babies on the kibbutz, that they actually have child minders, other women who take care of the babies. And the mothers are actually quite separated from their children. They're allowed to breastfeed, but they're not allowed to be with their kids all the time. And I was just fascinated by that and kind of freaked out by it, of course. And oh my God, it's like The Handmaid's Tale, but wait, that's all wrong. And I was wondering, did it go on for a long time? Was it extremely common? Obviously, you found that in research and learned about that.
Yep.
So how did that work? Because my novel also has it's a lot to do with child raising, child rearing, and the work of that. Along with women's work, like how our lives are so defined by our work. So I was just curious about that particular piece, but then the larger discussion and your book has a lot of work in it too, people doing their various jobs, right?
Well, we were chatting, in the hospitality suite beforehand about how there's this, the editor for this book kind of picked up on how there's a lot of bureaucracy and forms and stuff that run through the book and references to that. And it's fascinating how you
poeticized it. You made it into poetry.
We kind of raised it up so it was a little bit more, we used titles to kind of make that a little more, not obvious, but just to kind of lift it up a little bit so it wasn't quite so buried. But that's a different kind of work too, right? That we
so
have
we can
to
talk
deal
about
with.
work a little bit. But first, tell me something about the kibbutzim and not having access to their own babies.
Yeah, so they the kibbutzim were attempts at utopia. It was a particular kind of utopia set in a time and place, and it was very it had at its heart a kind of socialism that today we would think of as quite radical, Marxism often, and everybody was to be equal. And so I think the babies were raised in a baby house, and even so a lactating mother could go and breastfeed, but she wouldn't even necessarily breastfeed her own baby. She would breastfeed a baby, and the idea was to free up women to be able to work the fields, which was the sort of highest priority in the 20s when I was writing. And so I think there was like a rhetoric that was like, we're allowing them their inheritance of working and being creative full beings, but there was also, they just needed everybody to work the fields and a small number of people to be with the children. And so I think, like maybe any small community where there are rigid rules, there was something purely intentioned. Of course, every type of person was involved in the endeavor, right? So, but the ideology was sort of, there was something pure about it, and then the difference between theory and practice. So like you said, it was extremely difficult for many of the mums to sort of surrender their babies like this. And somebody said to me recently, there exists today a whole branch of psychotherapy in Israel about focusing on kids who grow up in these baby houses. Yeah.
Do you know how long they continued?
I think it continued. So my book is set in the 20s, and again there was a variation between the different kibbutzim, but I'm going to say like for a decade. Like I think once they got to I recently read a memoir that was set in the 50s, and she was raised in a baby house. So wow. So I guess longer.
Well, it's only recent. I mean, the revolution of children's rights is actually a very, very recent thing, and our emphasis sort of in psychology on child's and particularly early development, that's fairly recent. Like that is the 50s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. It was post-war, really.
Yeah. The woman whose memoir I read, she was writing about her cohort, and she wrote in the we voice, like they were a mass of children, and they all experienced something together. And but definitely I was looking a lot at the gulf between intention and
reality. What happens? What our intentions are. What actually happens. Yeah.
And I found in reading your novel, I was just fascinated by the kids, the two little boys, and the like rambunctious. Just the scenes with how she's navigating being their mother and having her career and her lover and her husband. And
she was so busy.
She was really busy. She was super busy.
It was hard. It was hard to write the book too, for that very reason. Dealing with somebody who was so incredibly busy. Well, I did want to. I think that so many of us work so much, even if we're not like gainfully employed, we're doing things like we're volunteering, or we're working in some community way, or we're raising several children, or we're working several jobs, or whatever. So I wanted to explore that, just to have somebody who was stuck in the mundane cycle of daily life with children. And it can be very, very mundane, particularly when they're small and they're physically exhausting. And, Eliza, the character, has 2 boys, and they're 6 and 7, 5 and 6, 6 and 7. So small and rambunctious and kind of hyperactive and tearing around the house all the time and beating each other up. And then she also runs her own business, and she does most of the house cleaning. So if you want to, experience house cleaning eroticized, I've done it. I wanted to try and bring the erotic back into this person's life. And I agree. I may have gone overboard.
I actually thought you didn't go overboard.
Thank you. Thank you. So let's drink to that. Let's drink to going overboard. Damn it. Cheers. Cheers. Go overboard.
And I thought the boys were actually pretty well behaved.
Did you?
Yeah.
Good.
I thought she did a good job with them.
Well, there's just that scene where they're beating each other up while their parents are, or the older boy is beating the younger child up while their parents are upstairs dealing with a world event that has just happened, some violent world event. And downstairs, the older boy is like beating the smaller one up. And so it was just work and violence and sex and house cleaning. I wanted to throw it all into the mix. You know what? I know we're never supposed to read Goodreads, right? We're never supposed to read the reviews on Goodreads. Like, that's a really negative practice for writers.
Oh, we're not supposed to
You just got to tell me this stuff. I'm new.
Okay, so don't.
I had been reading.
Don't read Goodreads
I have
because.
never done it.
Yeah, you're so wise. It's just like the blurb says. Wise, one of the wisest writers of our time. She has never read her Goodreads reviews. Because I read my Goodreads reviews on this book recently, and one woman said, "This book is a hot, draggy mess."
Does that mean she liked it?
And I was like, "That's a great description." But no, she didn't like it. But that's just it. I feel like modern life is kind of a hot, draggy mess. Like, you've got so much stuff going on, and you're really busy, and you never have sex with your partner anymore because you're totally exhausted, and they didn't do the fucking dishes. So I wanted to explore that and also make her work. And so, when you're having an affair and you're busy working, you inevitably also screw up your schedule. So she's so busy working that
She needs the Bristol Awards.
That's
she
what I was
should
just
have
going to
had
say.
the
She needs the
Bristol
spreadsheets.
That's right.
Okay, so what I'm also.
I found it interesting how
She's been
like
writing
the
it all
way in
down.
which the how radical it seemed to have the sex scenes were amazing and real. And yet there was this, like, I haven't read this book before. I have not read a novel that has this kind of sex, like, what's the word? Throughout. What's the word? Throughout. Integrated.
Integrated? Like, I think we all understand this motion.
That's right. Anyway, it was wonderful to read and also, like, really necessary.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm glad you liked it.
But you're right, it is rare. And
rare.
Why
Why?
do you think that people shy away from doing? I mean, it's hard for sure. It's difficult to write when I have tried it, I found it difficult to write a good sex scene without lapsing into any kind of cliche and make it believable and sexy and all that stuff. But why do you think people, like, I do feel like it's true that people tend to avoid it.
Yeah. Well, I was in Estonia a couple of years ago. I was still working on this book, and I got together with my Estonian translator and a bunch of other Estonian women, and we were talking about these very themes. And they were great. In fact, they kind of helped me work on the ending of the novel because I didn't quite know how to finish off my hot, draggy mess. And Kathleen Kaldma, who is a preeminent translator of many languages into Estonian and also a very well-known writer herself in Eastern Europe, said, just make sure with these scenes that you don't employ the Estonian way of writing the sex scene. And I was like, I don't read Estonian, obviously, and I don't know very many writers except for Kathleen who are translated into English. So I said, so what is that? Like, what is the typical Estonian sex scene? And she said, okay, it's complex, but this is basically how it unfolds. They went into the room and shut the door. So she was really, because we had this discussion, how much detail should I use, which kind of words, and she was like, name it all, and leave the door open. So why we don't do that? I think because sex is such a complicated, painful, awkward, divisive subject that. And it's been done badly so many times before on the page and in real life, right? That we, it's a difficult subject matter, and it was fascinating to do, to talk to a bunch of people yesterday at the workshop that I did, and just sort of try and articulate myself as a writer, how to do that well, and why. What is the purpose of writing honestly about sex? Not in a kind of distant, gauzy erotica way, and not for pornographic purposes, but to actually describe character and to describe people grappling with life and how and where sex fits into all of that. I obviously was trying to figure that out for myself, which is part of the reason why I wrote the novel. But it hasn't been reviewed in very many mainstream Canadian magazines or newspapers. Like only the Globe and Mail and Winnipeg Free Press have reviewed the book. Yay, Winnipeg! So I think it's kind of an awkward, people don't quite know what to think about it.
Your publisher should send it to Bust.
Bust. Mm-hmm. Okay. I will get them to send it to Bust.
They rate things by how many boobs they get.
Oh, really? Well, there are a lot of boobs in this novel. It's
nice
true.
Ones.
Thank you. I sort of feel like I'm taking that personally. I will. Sexuality is such a big part of everybody's lives, but I don't know what happened with literary, with the literary world. Why we haven't taken that more as a subject. And in fact, when men take it as a subject, like Nicholson Baker with his book Holes, or Tom Perrotta with Little Children and his new novel Mrs. Fletcher, Daniel Handler just put out a book called All the Dirty Parts. They're very celebrated. And read and kind of lifted up as an example of sexuality being written. But that doesn't happen very much with women writing sex.
That's so frustrating.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I'm taking this as
do it!
My new, out of spite.
No.
I'm going to take this as motivation for my next book.
Do it. I think more people should write more
into
honestly
reading
about it.
Although I know that you were going to read.
Yeah,
Yes,
before, after.
We're already getting a little ready for this. So.
I think it's time.
It's time. I think it's time. Dun, 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 dun. Oh, now I have performance anxiety, everybody. I don't know if I can in front of so many people. Uh-huh. Oh, luckily, it is my reading copy. So, I think, the beauty of bisexuality is that you really can switch back and forth. So while Eliza is having her affair. She's married, and she's having an affair with a woman that she literally meets in the change room. And while she's having her affair, I mean, she's a very bad woman, very transgressive. While she's having her affair, she actually does continue having sex with her husband. It's true, she should have died in the end. That's what a couple of American editors basically said. They were like, I don't know, we've never dealt with this before. Nothing happens to her. I was like, no.
So there was an expectation that she would have to be punished.
She would have to be punished. You know, that there would be no human way that would be language-based. This is from the editors. They're in the United States, but it has not been particularly popular either in Europe. And that's partly because it's been labeled a bisexual book or a queer book, right? But it's about a woman who's married to a man and they love each other, and it's very much about marriage and the politics of marriage too. So anyway, whatever. Yeah, just make sure you put like a lot of men's sex in there. There should definitely be some cocks in your book. More cocks than just one. The penises will get more airtime.
Thank you.
I have to admit.
Would you recommend writing a book like this to a friend?
Only if the woman dies in the end. Or maybe she wouldn't have to die. You know, maybe, I mean, the United States does love, if you take a look at their, like, you know, their crime, their sort of investigative crime fictions and stuff on TV, the series on Netflix and stuff. You know, they are fascinated by the intersection between sex and violence. Like everything, as Ellen Mestai said to me last night, well, if it has sex in it in America, it's just inevitably going to have some really bad violence in it too, even if they don't necessarily meet up. He said, that's just the culture. He kept saying, it's just the culture. That's part of the culture there. Like, you know, part of the culture of Japan is very good rice. It's like, Jesus, if it has sex in it, there has to be some terrible violence. Anyway, I was working against that. I didn't want that. And in fact, though I didn't want that, the book is full of this kind of the pressure of the violence of the world, pushing in on all of us. And of course, we live in a violent world and a world that is very unjust, where we suffer, but also people who are connected to us suffer. And then there's a whole enormous population of people disconnected from us who are also suffering and prone to extraordinary violence and very, very vulnerable. And I wanted that to be felt in the novel, though I didn't allow that to take the heart of the novel. I wanted to keep it closer. And so there is an incident that is horrific that happens. The novel takes place, again, distantly during the Arab Spring, sometime during the Arab Spring. Not necessarily 2011, it could be 12 or 2013, we don't really know. And an incident of terrible violence takes place, and of course, all the characters in the book hear about this act of sexual violence that happens in Egypt. And they hear about it, of course, the way we all hear about things, you know, via the internet or CBC or whatever. We hear the news and we know what's happened. And it kind of creates a ripple in their relationships. And in an odd way, it makes them come closer to each other. That night, and this is Eliza and her husband, that night they made love. It wasn't their rare, customary rush against and through each other's bodies. It was not fucking, nor was it plain old friendly sex. It was the authentic, hungry, almost painful making of love, the breaking of a long fast. They had to be careful, as one who has known famine cannot gorge on food, but must go slowly, taking sustenance in little by little. The fullness and tenderness hurt Eliza especially because she felt guilty. She felt guilty about Shar, and she felt guilty for being safe. Eliza touched Andrew's face. He had his hand on her head, his fingers in her hair as they kissed. The opening and the thrusting were like eating, as though each part they touched was food that had long been denied and suddenly was given over, gift after gift after gift, the bounty of two bodies, the fingers with their precise nicked gloves of skin, every handful of the aging night-alive flesh, freely given, taken hungrily, back and forth, here, take this, eat, as though the sweetness might sustain a stranger, undo harm, repair the irreparable by extending a miracle so private that no one could ever know what it was, what had happened here. It was magical thinking, impossible. Yet that was the wordless benediction as they touched each other and moved through the well-known stages. As Eliza's orgasm began, Andrew came inside her as deeply as he could and remained there, held, locked into her body, his eyes closed as she moved against him. It hurts, she thought, tears rising in her eyes as she swirled down the vortex of her own pleasure. It hurts. She was coming. At the center of that physical intensity was grief for the suffering in the world, always there, undeniable. But she could not let go and cry. If she cried, her own mundane truth would pour out, too, her confusion, her wrong. Stay, she whispered to Andrew, stay on top of me. I want to feel your weight. And she did want that, to feel the physical heft of this body that loved her body. But she also wanted him to hold her down like a lid, to keep the lies inside. Damn.
I think we have a question. Do we have a question?
Wow, it was just a spontaneous question from Patrick Crean back there.
Sure. So I'd be very curious, for anybody on the panel, especially Karen, why it is in Canada that we seem to be so embarrassed by sex. And that though, especially women like Barbara Gowdy or Susan Swan or Lynn Crosby, never make the prize lists if they write about sex. And the second part is the examples that you gave of American male writers. Don't forget John Colapinto and what happened.
John Colapinto.
What happened to his novel?
To Undone?
Yeah, it was
Undone,
rejected by
yeah.
42.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there was a kind of moral panic going on. But
Yeah.
what is it about the Canadian sensibility? Is it a kind of colonial self-loathing kind of thing?
Yes, I totally blame it on the
No.
British. 100%. I feel oppressed by the British even now. Joking. I don't know. You know, Canadians were pretty serious people. We're polite and well-behaved. We try. At least that's our reputation. We try and uphold that reputation. Of course, there are lots of holes in that cloak these days. We're seeing through it. Beautiful Losers, yes.
If there ever was a dirty book.
Right,
that
Beautiful
was-
Losers by
yeah,
Leonard Cohen.
Leonard Cohen.
Well, that's why he turned to songwriting. Leanne, keep going with your music.
My next book is like all sex.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. But funny enough, it takes place in Asia.
Oh, that's good though. As long as
Well-
it's not on Canadian soil, it's okay. And you don't have kids, right?
I do not.
Okay, so that's much better. If you're young and you don't have children and you're writing about sex, it's good. Good. Well done.
We'll see.
When
But I was just thinking about the awards, and books that have sex don't seem to get awards, but I don't think that's true in Asia. And
interesting.
like there is this Akutagawa Prize in Japan, and there's this author who wrote this book called Snakes and Earrings, and she's female, and it's
and so it won the prize, and it's a huge bestseller.
Yeah, and I think that maybe
I should move to Japan.
Well, yes, I would like to see you do that and see what happens. But I think that, like, okay, so I have a strong connection to Singapore and the Singapore writers scene there, and Singapore is a very what's a good word to use? I mean, they go by the rules kind of thing, right? And so there's been this wave of like, we're not going to play by the rules anymore, and it's very exciting to Singaporeans. And so there's all these like books, poetry, novels that have lots of sex and transgressive behavior politically or sexually or whatever it is, and people are really supporting it, and through non-national awards, but independent awards. And I think there's something to do with being like repressed in some sort of way. Like in Japan there is, and I actually talk about this in my book, there's this duality between being like the polite, good rice Japanese or whatever you want to say, but and then there's a history of violence and a lot of atrocities in Japanese that the Japanese have done. So it's like they can be horrible people and they can be really good people. And I mean, you can say this about anyone, but I think there's something about this repression and that it's going to like erupt, which is totally what I talk about in my book. But I think that has happened in Singapore literature, that there's this eruption and people are just like, thank God, you know, and maybe it's like they're not having sex for a long time.
Yeah, they're breaking out.
Yeah, exactly. They're breaking out. And so maybe that'll happen here.
So sorry. So you're going to help that happen as well in CanLit, you know? I think that's part of the solution, is for people to simply, both men and women, for us to just take that as a serious subject matter. And that's what I said with the change room. Because it was so interesting to me, I thought I will allow it to be a serious subject to me, not just as a woman. I mean, for most of us, sex, whether we have it or not, sexuality is a serious subject, and for most men too. So I was gonna, most humans, even people who are quite asexual, they also need to be. There's a constant pressure in our culture to define somehow sexually, to name yourself, to give yourself a label, an identity. And so we all take it quite seriously, except as a topic of real exploration in our literature. So I don't think I consciously knew that. I just wanted to have fun. I wanted to write a novel that could help me write about Canada, because I'd lived abroad and written abroad so much. I'd written about other cultures so much that I didn't really know how to write. I didn't know how to see Canada, and I didn't know how to write about it very well. So I wrote a book of poetry called Come Cold River, which is a very dark book of poetry about all the things we don't see in our beautiful white country, our clean country. And that was a hard book to write. But then I did want to have fun. And one of the subjects that I know this will be really shocking, that I really enjoy, is sex. So I thought, I'm going to take it seriously and think about it and write it and see what happens. So I think more writers should just do that. We don't have to not do that anymore. We're free. We can do it.
I'm wondering if Jennifer has any poems about sex in her book. I'm aware that we haven't heard you read, and I really want to hear you read it.
Not so much in this book, definitely in my first two, and my first collection of poetry, lots of sex.
Or life poems. I mean, sex is being alive, right? And some of the poems are like wildly alive, kind of some of the dream poems and things in your books.
And I think I am going to read one or two of the dream poems for sure. But just to finish the topic of sex and being represented in CanLit, and the question about why do we not see that more on the prize lists and stuff. And I don't know the answer to that, because of course sex can be as serious as anything else in literature. Why wouldn't it be? It's a major part of who we all are. And maybe we just need to keep writing about it. More people need to do that, and for it not to be treated as a separate genre that serious literature can't possibly have a lot of sex in it, which is clearly ridiculous. So maybe just the more people face that head on and the more of that that's published, then eventually we will see it. But yeah, I don't know what the answer to that is.
I can say, having just been on the Giller jury 2 years ago, that there's also less method and more madness. Like, I think it really, there's a real, you guys probably all know this if you've been on Canada Council juries, or I'm not saying there are not built-in biases and all kinds of, you know, unconscious prejudices that we all have, but also there's really a random lottery thing happening in there with a bunch of people with different aesthetics, different priorities. The Giller now has 5 people on the jury, which is a lot of different opinions and tastes and aesthetics, and you're sort of trying to come to some kind of consensus. So not to, anyway, just that little bird's eye view. Yeah.
I just want to say that I was at the men's forum, which was a similar moderator and so on. And the topic of sex was prevalent in their discussions, but it was very different from what's happening here. So in
what way?
Really
how did they discuss the topic? Seeing as I wasn't there.
Well, they talked about sex as how it related to their novel or their poetry, and how they integrated it into. You women are talking about sex in a more blatant way that brings it to the reality of how perhaps women experience it. It's a very different dialogue that's going on there. So I'm very fascinated. But, you know, go back to Shakespeare. I mean, wasn't there sex in Shakespeare's plays? Like, so, and this gentleman who mentioned, you know, about, you know, in the States and other men novelists who get the prizes and they integrate sex. Like, I don't know. It's just, I'm fascinated with how different the dialogue is. So, just want to say that.
I love that we have someone who has attended both and can compare.
Yeah, interesting.
Okay, I haven't been keeping track of time, but
How
I should
are we
probably.
doing for time, by the way?
Okay, time for me to read, and then we'll do more questions.
We'll take questions, right? Like after we chat.
Okay, so I'm going to read a handful of poems from my book, which is called Beautiful Children with Pet Foxes. There's a few different series of poems that run through it. One is self-portraits. Another is what we were talking about a little bit earlier with forms and bureaucracy. So there's a series of poems called Incident Report. So they're sort of taken from the concept of a police incident report and different sort of sections, but they don't resemble those kind of forms at all. And then another series in the book is dream specimen poems, and these are based on actual weird dreams that I've had. And it is true that if you start a dream log and you start keeping track of your dreams and writing them down, you start to remember them a lot more clearly. That was true for me. So the dream specimen poems in the book are structured in 3 parts. The first part is like a depiction of the dream. The second part uses kind of fun, cheesy internet dream analysis techniques, and so it's sort of the outcome of the analysis. And then the third part is sort of like a hybridization dream imagery language. It's hard to describe. So I'm going to read one of those. I'll just do that first since I just did the nice little preamble for that. This one's called Dream Specimen 23. I was lost in a seething crowd of breeding women who sneered at me. My mother, milk-eyed, the only one to help deliver it like a parcel on a porch. More like a planet, she said, made of lead and slop that you have to push out and send back into orbit. A doctor showed me a video of the baby, decaying and gray. Transitional phase, fear of responsibility, deteriorating hopes, warning. Rejection of creativity, indifference, self-deception, gaining significant amounts of weight and choosing inappropriate clothing, bad timing, bad luck. Feast of rest, crunch hormone, transplant fellatio, lieutenant to self-starter, semitone to lifespan, renaissance of crinoline, badger tin, washcloth, wallaby, lullaby, cult hotspot, cuckold hospital, galaxy silk, trauma phony. You too are blasphemy. You are too bleak. You bleat. You bleeder.
See, there is sex.
Or the outcome of it. I'm going to read a couple of the self-portrait ones and then maybe another dream. This one's a self-portrait as a mollusk. A red shell grows over my forehead, across one eye, as my cheeks cave in retreat, shielding the dark, wet folds. I'm bereft of speech and bone and the ability to perceive distance. Bivalved, hingeless, I'm trying to rest in this spiral shell, but the last year has snuck in with me. All those silver hallways teeming with mothers. Branches scrape my slime, their dry hands reaching out, looking for lost daughters, ones they gave away or ones they should have. And I'll read one from the incident report series as well, so you get a little taste of all the different series in the book. Incident report location. The porch juts out like a sneer. The name of a girl's father, redacted, still paces the sidewalk out front. The attic crammed full of everything I try to avoid. The phone calls made too late. The hospital rooms unentered. The secrets nudged free, now tumbling down the stairs. In the wood stove, I build a fire, though I know what hides in ash. Fingernail, intake form, snail shell, and bright red embers, dressed up and ready to go.
That's a great
Wow. I think I'll read another dream poem, mostly because it has the word bros in it, and that's fun for a women and words panel. Dream specimen 95. And these are all true dreams. I'm alone in trees as the day dissolves to a bright royal blue, glowing thick and settling on the world like a bomb. I feel free and smile and throw my arms wide like when no one has betrayed you in a really long time. Then a white pickup truck full of 4 bellowing bros hurtles into the clearing, splinters the trees, and crumples right next to me. Posture still perfect, their pale heads ringed with blood like the crowns they thought they already wore. This is the interpretation section. Desire for sexual stimulation. Failed transactions with foreign syndicates. Problems coming to an end. A demand for better treatment. Beware of false prophets. The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. A military strategy. A risky person. A lack of respect. Problems with relatives. Adding to someone's pain. Harboring deep anxieties. Denial. Girl of apostrophe. Sorry, I screwed that up. Girl of ignore. Deflection apostrophe. Tales are question to a curse. Handbag a diatribe. Questionnaire to curtain raiser. Cover under thick bolts of cloth. Opinions, adoptions, abortions, cellulite. Broadcast fist thrombosis, new tracheas, a threat faucet. Bluff gnats at the door. Tails are quill to customer, box cutters to management, marble suit punishment, clench whore verbs in an ideology cul-de-sac.
Any questions?
What's your most recent weird dream? Anyone on the panel?
Well, I just wanted to say it's so much fun to hear poetry after your work is a little bit more prose oriented. So to hear that poetry, it's just, isn't it one, it just feels like being cut loose from the duties of narrative. You know, like there's just so much freedom in it, especially in your poetry. It just goes in so many directions to so many places, and it is like a dream. Like there's so many jump cuts, so many things are happening, and yet they make, I know this is so corny, it's just like in a dream, it all makes sense to you. It was beautiful. It was beautiful to see so many different images and have them do this strange, mysterious fitting together. I mean, that's the beauty of poetry. Why we were talking about this by email, why it can feel so alive. It can evoke aliveness so completely, like just the weirdness of being alive.
Well, and it's my fourth book, too, and I kind of hit a point where, not that I didn't care, but I just felt like it's poetry. It does have, let's be honest, a more limited readership than a novel. And I just want to write the kind of poems that I want to read. And and a lot of it is I didn't read the heavier, more intense, more personal stuff that is in this book, but the dream poems were like my breaks or my recess or something. So they were more fun to write than some of the more difficult stuff that was about trauma and things like that. So, and I structured the book in a way that sort of used the dreams as like these little, you get a bit of breathing space before you know, so it was sort of intentionally structured that way. But yeah, I did just really kind of have a lot of fun with language with this book, and didn't care how weird it got.
Yeah, well, no, it's released, right? The language is so released. The images are so released. It's fascinating that it's not extended metaphor often. They're weirdly connected, like somehow connected, but it just goes off in all these different directions. It's like fire.
Well, once the manuscript was finished, too, there were a lot more connections.
Yeah, you start to see the larger picture. Yeah,
because it was over a period of probably 5 or 6 years, I think, that the poems were from. And yeah, so it wasn't deliberate, but then I started to see the connections, and then my editor, too, would, you know, it's new to her. So she was just like, there's a lot of stuff about forms and bureaucracy throughout. I'm like, yeah, now that you mentioned it, that makes sense. So we started to see these, even though they weren't deliberate or obvious linkages, but they were there.
Do you know why you wrote about forms, and why did you do that with the idea of forms and formalities?
Well, it would be easy to say that it's because I work in a large university and deal with bureaucracy every day of my life, that it was bits of my day job infiltrating. But I don't think that's really true. A lot of the book, especially the long poem, the title poem, Beautiful Children with Pet Foxes, is like about 15 pages long, and it deals with, in a nutshell, in a very allegorical, metaphorical way, it deals with the failure of the mental health system to help those in crisis who need it most, and my experience with trying to navigate those systems. So, yeah, I mean, it's a crisis. It's terrible. People who need to access these services can't, particularly in, like, rural areas. Not everyone who needs help lives in a big city, right, where it is a little easier to get what you need. And if you live in a small town or a rural area, like many in the population of Canada do, it's almost impossible, right? There's a GP, that's it. There's not experts, and, you know, who's going to drive 100 kilometers when you're in crisis? Like, so I was dealing with a lot of these ideas in my life and then in the writing. And so, yeah, trying to help someone who needs these services and just really experiencing firsthand the layers of, like, bureaucracy that you have to go through and the dead ends that you hit repeatedly. And this is as a family member, not as, you know, someone in crisis, but and this is when you have several people trying to do this, just how impossible it is to get what you need. So I was living for some time trying to figure out how to navigate these bureaucracies and endless forms, and just, you get sort of caught in these like Kafkaesque dead ends where things are. So anyway, so going through that life experience informed, I think, a lot of this imagery of like these incredibly surreal, frustrating experiences with bureaucracy. So yeah.
No, it's beautiful. It's beautiful.
So that's your experience with forms. What is your experience with animals?
Well, like everyone, I'm sure, I just love them. And they're so fascinating. And I found so writing about the difficult stuff that I was just talking about, I didn't realize that I was doing that, but I was trying to figure out a way to write about this stuff, right? And so there were a lot of drafts that were just like bad and not really working. And I was trying to figure out, I guess, how to articulate this stuff. And when I started using animal personas and imagery and telling it through these sort of metaphors, then it really all fell into place and I was able to do it. But when I was trying to do it from like
a human perspective.
Yeah, it's still from a very human perspective, but when I used different metaphors, it really clicked into place a lot.
Because the book is full of animals. It's such an animal alive book.
Well, and also I was not living full-time in Toronto. I was also living part-time in the country as well, and kind of doing both. And I did get just like really fascinated by the fact that when you live in a more rural area in the winter, you can see moose or deer or, you start trying to figure out identifying the footprints and, you know, and getting glimpses of, the fox that lives down by the stream. And I just got really obsessed with that, and it started to work its way in. And in doing so, it really allowed me to write about stuff that I was finding it difficult to articulate in a more human way. So once I got on the fox, then I was able to do what I wanted.
Yeah, and Bill Richardson made the comment last night that has to be one of the most beautiful titles in CanLit right now. Can you just say it again? Because it is so beautiful.
It's called Beautiful Children with Pet Foxes. And please, no one ask me where the title came from.
We're not going to ask.
I don't know. But one of the topics that we had kind of thrown around via email before today was talking about just finding time to write, whether it's, as a parent, or which I'm not, but also like if you have a full-time day job, right? Or just whatever life responsibilities you have, how do you work in the writing? And for me, during a lot of the writing of this book, I was just getting up like an extra hour before my job and having this dedicated time with coffee and doing all these sort of prompts and writing exercises.
Quiet time in the morning.
Yeah, and it was great. Precious. But I came up with like a lot of weird stuff that I can't even answer, like where it came from. And that was one of the phrases was beautiful children with pet foxes. And I can't for the life of me remember what weird early morning pre-dawn thought process led to that, but it worked. So
it's perfect. It's such a gorgeous title.
I think we should see if there are questions.
Yeah, I see one at the green scarf.
And the last.
Oh, at the back?
Sorry, I have another question. Do each of you have a woman editor for each, or are you working with male editors?
That's a great question. I had a female editor.
I have a female editor who I was with her at Raincoast, and then she went to Anansi, and I went with her to Anansi, and then she went to Doubleday, and I went with her to Doubleday, and now she's at Knopf, and I went with her at Knopf, so that maybe tells you how I feel about her. I'll go with her anywhere.
Wow, that's nice.
Male.
It's okay, you're still in the club. It's totally fine.
But I have to say, he was amazing. Yeah.
He was as good as a woman, right? Kidding. Joke. Total joke. I too have a woman editor. Yeah. Yeah. But I'm very open to men as well. That is so bad. I'm sorry. I won't do that again.
She's on a roll.
Well, and having a great editor who gets what you do is so incredibly important, right?
I think
We all know that.
Yeah, that's the most important
Male or
thing.
female, it's key
Yeah.
that they understand what you're trying to do and can help you
And
do
then
that
see
somehow.
things that maybe you don't even know you're trying to do and help you kind of bring that up.
I often use the analogy of like it's the difference between dating and being married. It's like you don't have to establish each time the whole conversation, like the terms and the language, and you have a shared like rubric or dialogue together.
Well, you know, I was just on the topic of male or female editors. There's a book out right now too called Deep Salt Water by Marianne Apostolides, and it was also published, I think, by Book Thug. It was the publisher of a couple of these books. And she had a male editor, and that book is really about environmental destruction viewed through the lens of an abortion. So it's a very powerful book and a very, very profound book. And yeah, her editor was a man, and she was speaking recently, and I heard her talking about how he just kept asking her to go the next step, to take the work a little bit deeper, and she really appreciated that without him the book wouldn't have become what it is now, and it's pretty amazing book. So it's dependent upon the individual really, and that fit that you mentioned too, how good the fit is between editor and writer. It's so important.
Yeah, that's a book I'm really looking forward to reading. Actually,
Yeah.
I have it. I got it from her at the launch, but I haven't read it yet. But
I
it
have
seems
read
powerful.
it.
I was going to ask you if you knew it.
Yeah, well, it's through the same publisher as Jennifer and I, and there were I felt like there were a lot of similarities between her book and my book, and I'm a collage artist as well, and she has a lot of collage in her book, and we both comment on environmental concerns, and yeah, I felt really happy that we were on the same
at
publisher.
home, yeah.
Our books are very
That's
different, but it's like Bill was saying last night, there's these kind of synchronous things like themes and stuff that come out. And I thought one of our themes was, well, I feel like there's themes, but I can't remember. Ghosts were one, but though the ghost in the change room, I thought maybe it was like the character Talia, perhaps, that was always like this presence in Eliza's mind. Yeah.
Any other questions? We're probably getting close to the end of our session. Mark, Webb.
What is a ghost and what does it mean to you? What is a ghost and what does it mean to you?
That's interesting. I was just kind of thinking about that the other day. That I don't.
I'm so glad
think...
you want to answer that question.
I'm like, I got this one.
Go.
Of course, my answer is usually like, ultimately, I don't know. But I don't think it has to mean sort of the literal what we think of as a ghostly presence as like a, after death sort of, here's that person again. I don't, for me, it doesn't always mean that, but just sort of a shadow of, can be like a shadow of an event even that's affected you powerfully. And it can just, talking about it in ghosts in writing, I think it can just be sort of images that recur in a way that are inflicted from a powerful event in the narrative, whether it's fiction or poetry. But yeah, I definitely think that the concept of a ghostly presence in writing can definitely be much more than just the literal after death presence, which I also am really fond of, but that definition. But I also think it can be a lot more allegorical.
Yeah, I think ghosts in fiction, and not just fiction, but ghosts, as we conceive of them or don't believe in them or whatever, they're potentialities. So they're energy that is a kind of potential realness that, for whatever reason, cannot become. So that's why so many of us feel haunted, because we're full of potentials that cannot be realized for whatever reason. And the more haunted, the most haunted people I have ever met are those who they had many potentials. Often the great potential is to be loved and to receive love, and that potential is they don't receive or they are not able to give or receive love, and so they're therefore very haunted. But I don't think it's only I don't think it's only love. I think it can be any potentiality that is not fulfilled or not made real, because that's what a ghost is, right? They're not real. I mean, they are real, but they're not real. They don't have, again, the flesh that Sarah has throughout much of the book. And I love the beginning of that novel. It's so incredibly powerful because she names all the potentialities that she does not receive because she didn't have time, because she died. You know, so I think, ghosts are real. Ghosts are real.
And I feel like that's sort of the inverse of what I was saying, whereas I feel like the ghostly presence is almost when there's just so much of something so powerful and intense and maybe traumatic that it just keeps coming
pushing
back
through
when you maybe don't want it to, which is kind of the opposite of that. But they're both like, potentialities or too much of something made real.
Yeah. There you go. Figure that out. Take those two opposite things, you know.
I love where this conversation has gone, and I love the potential of where it could go.
Well, she just got another glass of wine.
I know. I'm staying. So I'm just going to talk to myself.
This concludes the onstage portion of this event, but a reminder that the authors will be sitting at the back. They will be signing books. Karen has to finish her wine. Jennifer has to finish her wine. So if you have,
Alison's going to get more wine.
Yeah, if you have further questions or you'd like to talk to them or get your book signed, please stick around. And again, thank you so much to all of you for coming, and thank you for sharing in this new format with us.
Thank you. That was great. That was wonderful.